So welcome everyone. We are very happy to have this panel this morning with three wonderful scholars that have been awarded with grants from the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship in the period 2018-2019. So this morning they are presenting the findings of the research. My name is Maria Cornou. I work for Calvin Institute of Christian Worship with international programs. And in this session, we will have three presentations that are very different in nature and in the fields, but have in common that they are focused on community and social justice themes. The panelists this morning are Dr. Lee Hardy. He already introduced himself, but I will say also that he is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at Calvin University and professor of philosophical theology at Calvin Theological Seminary. Dr. AnneMarie Mingo, assistant professor of African American Studies and Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies at Penn State. And Dr. Monique Ingalls, assistant professor of music at Baylor University. As I said before, this is part of our new grant that is for teachers and scholars. And it's a grant that supports research that promise to serve worshiping communities by strengthening Christian public worship practices. So there is a strong component in the relationship between research and the life of the church. Again, welcome to this panel. The way we will work is the panelists will present the findings from the research. And after that, we will open a time of question and answers. You can type your questions in the Zoom, and we will try to reply all of them as time allows. So welcome again, and Dr. Hardy, the time is yours.
Thank you very much. I think Chang can pull up my poster. Great. So there's the poster. My topic is communities of faith and affordable housing. It's born in large part by my experience in my own church and neighborhood, which I'll refer to later in a couple minutes. But I'm very thankful for the Institute for providing the grant that gave me an opportunity to travel to many sites in North America and in Europe to see exactly what churches and faith-based nonprofits were doing to advance affordable housing in their cities and in their neighborhoods. What I did was a lot of empirical research and interviews, and then I tried to categorize these efforts into different types, and then pull all of that material into a website that would be useful for churches that are thinking about doing something like this. And as you'll see, I've tried to organize the website on the basis of a kind of asset evaluation of the interested churches, whether they have extra land or more parking than they need or a lot of money. They can choose to get involved on the basis of their resources. So I'm going to go to screen share. This will stop others. Yes, I want to continue. I want to do my desktop. And I want to pull that up. I'm going to assume this is good for everyone. So I'm going to run through a number of slides quite quickly. Don't be too worried if you didn't see everything or catch everything that you hear or see. A lot of this is going to be included in the website. As I mentioned, much of this project is born of my own experience in Grand Rapids at Eastern Avenue Christian Reformed Church. That's a picture of the church on Eastern Avenue. It's located in what many people would call the inner city, in a neighborhood that is highly disinvested since the 1960s. This is what the block directly across the church looked like a year and a half ago, mainly vacant lots and abandoned buildings. But this is what it looks like now. Members of our church, including myself, decided to form an LLC and to pool private capital together to purchase the lots across the street, 5 of them that were individually owned, aggregate them and pass them off to an enlightened developer. We did that and we passed it off to Inner City Christian Federation, a faith-based housing organization that put together the financing for the construction of 2 4-story buildings with 65 units of affordable apartments and 6 live-work units on the first floor. So we wanted to not only support affordable housing in the neighborhood, but also try to support supply space for economic revitalization. This is a live-work unit on the north corner of one of the buildings. This is the architectural rendition of what a live-work unit would look like once it's furnished. The work unit, the commercial space is in front. There's a door to a 2-bedroom apartment in back. The person who rents or leases this space leases the whole package. This is the white box representation of the commercial space, which could be converted into a studio of some sort, or could be converted into a coffee shop of some sort. These are just possibilities. Moving on to Detroit, still in Michigan, I visited the Cass Community Tiny Homes Project, run by the Cass Community Social Services, which is backed by the United Methodist Church. They bought 20-some properties from the city of Detroit for a grand total of $15,000 a number of years ago. And they are building tiny homes in a rent-to-own program. So these tiny homes, between 250 and 450 square feet, are being rented for $1 per square foot to people who are coming out of homeless shelters in Detroit. If they rent this, their unit for 7 years straight, they own the unit, they hand them the title. There are total of 19 of these. About 9 of them were being built this past summer when I visited. Each one is architecturally unique, and many of them have been designed by architects pro bono. And each one comes with its own solar panel in the backyard to reduce electric utilities to almost zero during the summers. Moving on to Denver, another tiny home community, although this might be better described as a tiny bedroom community. These are basically bedrooms, 77 square feet. This project is being backed by the local Mennonite community. And these, there's a total of 19 of them. 8 were being built when I visited this summer there. Here's a finished unit. People, again, coming out of homeless shelters are given these spaces where they have some kind of privacy and security, an address, and the idea is that they would be there for 1 year while they stabilize their lives, get regular employment, and then move out to permanent affordable housing. You can see the garden in front here in the boxes. They are gathered around, the bedrooms are wired, but they're not plumbed. They're gathered around a common house, a double wide trailer that provides bath, kitchen, dining, and meeting facilities. Some churches have more land than they need. Here's an example from Longmont, Colorado with the United Church of Christ. They were able to segment off 1/2 acre of their property and to enter into a agreement with a local nonprofit housing organization to build 6 affordable units. This is an architectural rendition. Here's ground level. It was being constructed during the summer when I visited. This is a finished unit now in the finished in the winter. Staying in the Denver area, some churches have more parking than they need. St. John's Cathedral entered into a shared parking arrangement with a local liquor store and freed up 1/2 acre of their parking lot. And they gave that over for $1 a year lease to the St. Francis Center, which now offers 48 affordable units to people off the top of the vulnerability index in a housing first operation. This is the rooftop garden, gives a killer view of downtown Denver with the vegetable garden. Moving over to Philadelphia, some churches band together and often as a result give birth to a nonprofit organization. That's the case with Esperanza in the north side of Philadelphia. It's the result of a association of evangelical Hispanic churches. Esperanza owns now a old warehouse building in north side of Philadelphia in the Hunting Park area with 300,000 square feet of space. And they run a wide program of cultural and economic support for the Hispanic community, which includes a charter high school, performing arts center, music lessons, retail facade grants, and all sorts of stuff like that. But it also includes the Roberto Clemente homes, a rehabbed industrial building just a block from their headquarters with 38 affordable units on top and commercial space on the bottom. Going back to Detroit, Catholic parishes banded together in the early 1990s, predominantly African-American Catholic parishes, to do work in their community. Here are some of the results. This is a building that was put together with ex-offenders in mind. If you know anything about the challenges of returning to society with a felony, you know that getting a job and getting housing is very difficult. They built this building with 11 apartments, affordable on top, and a bakery on the bottom. And this building is occupied primarily by ex-offenders who have housing below, and they commute to work by walking downstairs into the bakery. And that's John Thorne on the left, who's the director of the Pastoral Alliance. They've also recently built a building with 36 affordable apartment units on Gratiot in East Detroit. And then years ago, they built a senior co-op housing with 65 units in the same neighborhood. Going back to Grand Rapids, smaller scale efforts on the part of Sherman Street, again in the same neighborhood as my church. Years ago, several parishioners put together an LLC. They bought a distressed property during the 2008 recession for $5,000. They put $40,000 into it and now rent it below market to a household. They don't make any money. Any money they clear from rent gets reinvested in the house with the tenant's advice. Some churches have decided that they could incorporate housing into their main sanctuaries. Here's an example from Canada. This building is being built in Hamilton, Ontario by the Houston Street Baptist Church in partnership with Indwell, another faith-based housing organization that is building 3 floors of affordable housing on top to provide 45 units within the same building. And this is construction now during last summer. Something similar is going on in Grand Rapids with the rehab of an existing building by Madison Church. They were given for $1 this building that was the old Christian high school, and they're rehabbing it to make for 2 floors of affordable housing on top with 42 affordable units. On the first floor will house the new offices of the Inner City Christian Federation, plus church offices, plus a childcare facility. The old high school chapel that was a Christian high school will now serve as the church for Madison Church, and this is the entrance off the side street. They're building a nice atrium in back. all of this looks kind of fresh and new, but I spent a good time in Europe looking at the tradition of the church and affordable housing. I can't go into detail here, but this is an example of courtyard housing that goes back some 500 years for the support of those who are in need of housing. In Leiden, this is the front door, rather austere, but if you open it, you enter this wonderful courtyard, which is still used for affordable housing for senior citizens. I have a lot of material on this, but I can't go into it now. There is a long tradition of the church accommodating those in need of shelter. This is not a new invention. And my final example will be from England, St. Mary's Church in Egham, Oxfordshire. This is the church built in the 1300s. If you enter this doorway, you enter a beautiful courtyard that was built in 1457 for the accommodation of 11 people from the parish in need of shelter, plus 2 priests for a total of 13. These courtyards were often built with either 12 or 13 units, 12 for the number of disciples or 13 for the disciples plus Christ. The arcade leads directly into the main sanctuary. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that in that sanctuary might be read a passage from Isaiah 58 about true worship. I think that there's an interconnection between true worship and social mission. And here the prophet asks whether true worship is made up by loosing the bonds of wickedness or to undo the straps of the yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? I've put all this material together in a website. And you can go to that. I hope that the website link will be on the Institute's website, but I've organized this material according to church resources. In addition, I've provided background information on affordable housing markets. You know, what is affordable housing? What is gentrification? What is lean urbanism, accessory dwelling units, and the like, that will help congregations get informed. And then especially for the Institute, I've included worship resources, both on-site liturgies and liturgical elements. I have one more big load of material to load in this weekend, and then it will be done. But here are links to all sorts of liturgical resources for churches that want to include the needs of the homeless and the housing insecure into their sessions, into their worship sessions. So that's my material.
Thank you very much. So inspiring. I'm so glad that we had this topic addressed in this presentation and in this grant. So I will give now the word to AnneMarie to do her presentation.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I would like to also thank the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship for granting me and all of my colleagues here one of the inaugural Teacher Scholar grants. My project has been impacted by COVID-19, and so we've requested an extension through November, which they have been offering many of us as a result. And so you'll see some preliminary things that I'm going to be sharing here. I'm going to share my poster so that you can have an idea of some of the things that we've been working on. My project is called Cultivating Courageous Resistors. Pastors, professors, practitioners partnering to serve the present age. There are a lot of P's. So Cultivating Courageous Resistors, pastors, professors, and practitioners partnering to serve the present age. You'll see some of the things here that we've learned so far, that engagement matters, finding great ways of sustaining engagement within your religious and faith communities. Community matters, building sort of these relationships of trust where you can share and ask questions so that you can have resources to build out syllabi, to prepare for speeches that may be in public spaces, to prepare sermons, etc. And then also diverse resources matter. And so we have a website, courageousresisters.com, which I will go to shortly in the program or in this presentation, where we're beginning to build out some of the resources. But this project really does bring together those three groups. We bring together women of color who are pastors, senior pastors in their various denominations. We bring together persons who are professors or academic leaders. And so one of our members is a dean at a seminary. And then also grassroots practitioners, those whose primary space of work is really within the streets and on the grounds doing social justice activist work. I'm going to ask you now, as I keep speed talking, to please grab your cell phone or something like that, because we're going to have an exercise that we're going to do shortly. So I just want you to have something available as I pull this part down and prepare to share the next screen. Okay. All right, so again, the project, Cultivating Courageous Resisters, you will often see me utilizing that as CCR because it is such a long title. I'm an academic, what can I say? We make up long titles. So this is a part of our work here. I myself am a professor. I'm also a preacher. I'm ordained an itinerant elder in the AME church. I've been ordained for 15 years. And then I'm also a grassroots activist. And in my work as a scholar, I draw from womanist theological ethicists, I draw from social ethicists, so from the Katie Cannons and the Peter Parises and the H. Richard Niebers. I also have been doing a lot of local and national social justice work as both an activist and an advisor for others. And in those capacities, I saw the need for this sort of collaborative space for people who are doing all of those types of things. And so this project, this CCR project, is really seeking to bring together key women of color participants from throughout the United States as collaborative partners to develop stronger models of local and national leadership in the Christian practice of seeking justice as a part of public social witness that extends beyond ecclesial walls and denominational boundaries. We are really trying to center resistance within the Christian faith within this project. So again, I ask that you grab your phone. If you have a QR code scanner that you have on your phone, you can scan directly this QR code and it will take you into our quick poll. If you do not, you can go to slido.com, SLIDO.com. You will enter the code courageous. And we will begin our first poll in just a moment. Uh-oh, that's not right. Okay, so grab that again. You can either screenshot, not screenshot, but you can either take a picture there with your QR code reader if you already have one of those on your phone, or you can go to slido.com and enter the code courageous. Once you're there, please go to polls. So here's our first poll question. What word or phrase comes to mind when you hear the word courageous? Please go ahead and enter in any words or phrases that come to mind when you hear the word courageous. Great, so we're seeing some of these words that are really starting to pop out. Brave, bold, strong. We'll hold it open for just a few more seconds as others are finding words, and you can enter more than one. Words or phrases that come to mind when you hear the word courageous. Okay. So yes, fearless is another word that we're seeing coming in a few times. I love seeing women facing fears, strength, having those conversations. You can have courageous and daring conversations. Okay, so we're gonna move on to our next poll. What word or phrase comes to mind when you hear the word resistance? Same process. What word or phrase comes to mind when you hear the word resistance? Justice, stand, pushback and strength, struggle when we're hearing resistance. But justice continues to stay there as one of these key words that's fighting injustice, fortitude, nonviolent, stopping, prophetic. I'm seeing some fabulous words coming up here. So we'll give about 5 more seconds for this poll before we go to our final one. Okay, thank you for your participation so far. I hope that you're also gaining a more expansive understanding of what both courageous can look like, and courage can look like, and what resistance can look like. In our final poll, this will ask you to identify what topic or topics you wish you were better equipped to address in your church. And for this, I'd like for you to think about perhaps some social justice topics or some things that you've had a little bit of trouble finding the words for, finding the language for. We're seeing racism and decolonization and sexism, Black women, how to address white supremacy and indigenous justice, wanting to better be able to speak and teach around ableism and heterosexism and justice as worship. I love that. That's exactly what I'm hoping. LGBTQ+, harmful police policies, multicultural churches, apathy. That's a huge one within many of our faith traditions and religious spaces. Okay, I'll leave it open for about 5 more seconds. These are fabulous. These are the challenging topics and the challenging types conversations that we often don't feel as equipped as we would like to be able to really address within our churches. The denial of issues, the way that theology furthers racism. So thank you so much for your participation in these 3 little polls. So what I would love to know is, what kind of topics, what other topics, how have you been able to address COVID-19 as it relates especially to Black, Latinx, indigenous communities? How have you been able to address police and state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown women and men? How have you been able to address families that have been separated at southern borders that include often Black men and women who are coming out of Caribbean nations and out of African nations? How have you been able to address economic inequities and health disparities and the rollback of ecological and other types of protections and mass shootings? When you see all of these types of things pop up in the news, who do you reach out to? What sources do you draw from, and how broad and expansive and deep are your sources? How do you find ways to face the issues instead of turning away from them? And how do you use your pulpit space or your classroom or your community spaces to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God? How do you center justice within your worship? Those became some of the questions that I was really trying to work through as I developed and created this project. And so cultivating courageous resistors has these multiple components as a result of trying to create these collaborative spaces, these collaboration circles where people can come together who are pastors, who are professors, who are grassroots practitioners, and be able to ask some of those questions. Hey, what's the latest sort of research as it relates to these health inequities that I'm starting to see show up in the news, but I don't really know how to address? How could I create a litany that speaks directly to this and incorporate that within my worship service? Those are the types of spaces where we're able to do some of this collaboration. We also offer a monthly prayer focus that can be incorporated into all of those spaces. And so if a prayer is offered up by a pastor, that prayer can also be utilized within the classroom of a seminary and can also be utilized in a grassroots space. We are planning a Courageous Resistors retreat, which we actually had scheduled for May. And of course, COVID-19 did not allow that to happen. And we will have a social justice virtual revival. We are trying to think more expansively about worship and about courage and about resistance. And so we've created a website, again, courageousresistors.com, where we are sharing some of those public proclamations. And so when I think about courage and the cultivation of courage, I draw a lot actually from Maya Angelou, who said that courage is the most important of the virtues because without it, no other virtues can be practiced consistently. She also said, I realize that one isn't born with courage, one develops it. And you develop it by doing small, courageous things in the same way that one wouldn't set out to pick up a 100-pound bag of rice. If that was one's aim, the person would be advised to pick up a 5-pound bag, and then a 10-pound, and then a 20-pound, and so forth, until one builds up enough muscle to actually pick up 100 pounds. And that's the same way with courage. You develop courage by doing courageous things. Small things, but the things that cost you some exertion, that can be mental and I suppose spiritual assertion, is what Maya Angelou leaves us with. And so you become more courageous by extending yourself and taking risk in the face of courage. You face your fears and you take the small steps and you begin to build your courageousness. So these are just some examples of a few courageous resistors, and I'd love for you to think about what courageous resistors you know within your own congregations, the courageous resistors you know within your own communities, and how can you collaborate with them and not only take wisdom from them and experiences from them, but share your own and share your resources and incorporate this sort of work together. One of the things that we've been working through within the Cultivating Courageous Resistors project is what I'm now calling this cross-pollination, where the learning and the sharing makes all of us better if we think about this from an agricultural standpoint. So we've got 7 persons that are currently a part of this project. I've not listed their names, but sort of their categories. So we have an AME presiding elder, who is a presiding elder over 24 churches in a rural southern state. We have a Baptist pastor and professor in the Northeast that just recently celebrated her 11th pastoral anniversary. We have a pastor who is launching a church plant in a Methodist denomination within the Mid-Atlantic, and she's considered one of the top women preachers in the nation. We also have a seminary dean in the Midwest, an adjunct professor and director of faith-based and interfaith affairs in the nation's 5th largest city. We have the national social justice organizer who is the organizer for a big event that just happened last weekend. For those of you who may be connected, you'll figure out what that event was. And we also have a photographer and digital storyteller in the Northeast, where we're looking at art as one of the other tools of resistance. And so each of these participants are all leaders in justice work, but they're still able to benefit from the collaborative and collective space for thinking and reimagining tools as methods of resistance. And so, yeah, I'll just keep going. Again, we've got the Cultivating Courageous Resistors website that I'm going to just show very quickly, if I can get to that as I continue speed talking. There we go. Share. So again, we've got the courageousresistors.com, and you can come here and find out a little bit of information about the project, and you can also reach out to us. We have some, sorry, I'm going very fast. We have some CCR resources that are available, and so you'll see that quote there that I just shared from Maya Angelou, and you'll also see a few of the examples of public proclamations that you might think about and use. And they generally have a link that also goes into something that's interactive. So you'll also find some examples of, these were some Pentecost preaching resources that we shared, an event for the Mass Poor People's Assembly, etc. And then there's also another section that is a private section just for the CCR CCR cohort, and I will try to log in quickly here so that you can see what that space looks like. I hope I remembered my password correctly. Okay. And so you'll see here that in this private space, those who are participating in the project have access to these collaborative circles. And it's in these types of spaces where, for example, you might find some of the books that they're working through, etc. Okay, so I will stop there. I think I am probably over time. I did want to show just one last thing, if at all possible. Oh gosh, this is so fast. So fast. Okay, so the last thing that I would just like to share is what I did as the closing and parting prayer for the very first session that we had, and it was a Franciscan blessing. This is also an example of the types of resources that are available. And so may God bless you with discomfort at easy answers and half-truths and superficial relationships, so that we may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain to joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and the poor. Amen. So that's a little bit about the Cultivating Courageous Resistors project. Thank you.
Amen. Monique.
Yes, hello and good morning. And first off, thank you so much. I am blown away by the richness of these all of these projects. AnneMarie and Lee, thank you so much for your wonderful work. So let me get my screen share going. Okay. You can do it. There we go. Okay. So, so my project focused on British gospel choirs, which have a fascinating and as of yet largely untold history, and how they play a significant, if not always recognized, role in society. So no one knew British gospel choirs were even a thing until the 2018 royal wedding, when the Kingdom Choir performed in front of around 2 billion people. Then they came forth on the scene, and I've heard from gospel choir contacts that a lot of interest in joining gospel choirs after that. So there are a lot of questions that scholars can ask about these choirs, but I'm interested particularly in how they bring people together across entrenched racial and religious differences. So for this project, I conducted ethnographic field research among gospel choirs in 3 British cities, Bristol, Birmingham, and London, last summer, to learn what strategies these choirs use to build convivial communities that acknowledge and honor the racial, ethnic, and religious differences of their members. So it's my hope, in my academic work, that in addition to filling a gap within music and religious studies literature on this understudied musical phenomenon, that these findings will also contribute to how music contributes uniquely to building bridges and while also showcasing the contribution of Black musical creativity to societal healing and justice work. So work on this project fell into 3 phases, one of which, as you can imagine, was curtailed a bit. But the first phase was field research that I mentioned, a 7-week trip last year to the UK in May and June 2019. In fact, I had just returned from that when I went to the first grants event. So I can't even remember. I was so full of unprocessed materials. Who knows what I told you all last year. But I had interviewed nearly a dozen gospel choir directors, observed over 20 gospel events, had informal conversations with choir members, and I got the chance to sing in 2 different gospel community choirs. And Kim Samuels, who's pictured, who's leading an alto or a middle voice sectional over there on the right, she was very generous, and she invited me, since I had been such a regular for those 7 weeks that I was there. I got to sing in the event that you see over on the left, a citywide event in Bristol Cathedral, which was a huge treat. So phase 2 was analysis of the materials. So during fall 2019 and spring 2020, up until March 4th, if I'm to be honest, I organized and analyzed field materials gathered the previous summer, reviewing and coding my notes, interview transcripts, and videos of rehearsals and performances. And I must acknowledge here that my understanding of various social, cultural, and spiritual dimensions of British gospel music was enriched by a newly formed informal network of researchers working on Black gospel music in the UK. They pointed me towards new perspectives from the literature on conviviality, British Black majority churches, and general works on race and ethnicity in the UK. And I'm profoundly grateful and will be citing them extensively. But, oh, sorry about that. Phase 3 was communication of the results of this study. So concurrently with phase 2, I have been communicating results via academic conference presentations, a workshop for clergy, and a short article for Naxos Musicology. My local congregation, Holy Spirit Episcopal Church in Waco, also implemented numerous changes to our choir program based on results of this research. And that's an unanticipated, and fruitful area that I could maybe talk about more elsewhere. But we've taken our choir, which had dwindled to 4 people, to an intergenerational choir of 21, using some of the approaches and principles and even the songs from some of these choirs. So some of the key insights that I've learned through this work is that gospel music is uniquely well suited for bringing people together across difference. And I think a lot of us have seen that happen, in the course of, worship at Calvin, at large events, at some of the stories of those in vital worship community grants. And I would go so far as to say, within the contemporary British context, that it is the only Christian musical form that can bridge both religious and racial difference. And one of the reasons that gospel is so useful, and this is from interviews with with these gospel choir directors and others, is that gospel is, so multifaceted that British singers understand it and identify with it in a number of ways. These are kind of the overlapping ways that people, when you ask, them to define, okay, so what is gospel music? Where did it come from? Who owns it? If it can be said, to be the property of, of one particular group of people. And the people who responded, said basically that there are, they emphasize variously that gospel's origins and owners as African Americans, first and foremost, members of the African diaspora, the global church, and then the popular music industry. So when considered as an African American music, the origins of gospel, interestingly, in the context of the United Kingdom, they are at geographical remove from all British singers. However, many singers of Afro-Caribbean or West African heritage identify more personally with the music as a product of the global African diaspora. Those who see gospel as primarily a music for Christian worship understand gospel to be a property of the global church. And I heard this in responses from, I'll say, many of the, in some ways unsurprisingly, many of the white choir leaders and directors, but also from a number of those of African heritage as well. Those who see gospel finally as a commercial popular music repertory, its sound world is familiar to just about everyone, even if only from television or commercials. So singers across racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds find gospel to be very, very accessible. As an interpretive framework for what I experienced in performances and learned through my interviews, I am calling British gospel choir performances convivial rituals. And I draw my understanding of conviviality from two thinkers, Roman Catholic social critic Ivan Illich and British post-colonial theorist Paul Gilroy. In his seminal book from 2004, Post-Colonial Melancholia, Gilroy uses the term conviviality to describe the social practices and strategies that people with widely diverging backgrounds and values use to live together without ignoring or effacing their differences. By extension, musical rituals that are convivial are those in which the meaning of musical participation, or even that of the ritual as a whole, is left open to interpretation. Gospel music is profoundly useful as the center of 21st century convivial rituals because it brings singers and sometimes spectators together in a shared social space without insisting on a shared interpretation of the activity. So gospel performances seem to have tapped into a collective hope, however contingent and fragile, that relationships across difference are possible even in a cultural landscape marred by exclusion of various kinds. The gatekeeper of convivial community is an intentionally cultivated ambiguity around the meaning and purpose of singing gospel music together. And one of the things I found was the degree of ambiguity certainly varied from choir to choir that I spoke with, but it was present in nearly all choirs whose leaders I spoke with or who I observed. So gospel choir directors, I think all of whom self-identified as Christians, define and maintain boundaries around what, if any, Christian practices are acceptable in the space of the choir rehearsal or performance. Leaders and singers must negotiate competing definitions of what gospel music is, and relatedly, conflicting ideas about the purpose of gospel choirs. Group solidarity, shared spirituality, and the pursuit of musical excellence are all mentioned as choirs' reasons for being, and choir directors have to work pretty hard to keep the space open for participants who value these aspects differently. So to illustrate the choir's directors' roles as gatekeepers of convivial community, I wanted to share with you a couple of memorable quotes from two choir directors, both of whom are committed Christians who founded multiple choirs, kind of choir franchises in the Bristol area. So Renewal Choir director Kim Samuels told me that her choir was formed, quote, on the basis of a Christian ethos, but we don't exclude anyone. So we do have non-Christians who come along just because they love the music. But interestingly, with those people, a lot of them say that they feel that the choir allows them that spiritual connection to God that they don't get because they don't go to church. Through gospel, they feel that they can connect somehow. Geraldine Laddie Luce, who started a gospel community choir network in Bristol, takes an approach similar to Kim Samuels. She interprets what's happening in her choirs through a theological lens that leads to a poignant critique of British evangelical and charismatic churches. And it is worth quoting Geraldine at length here. Quote, what appears to be happening in community gospel choirs is, in any other context, you'd call it prayer. In any other context, you'd call it worship. In any other context, you'd call it hearing from God or a word of knowledge or whatever. But the singers are not in a Sunday church setting. They're at graves, they're at bedsides, they're commuting, they're struggling with depression, but they're verbalizing stuff that in any other context would have, you know, weighty inferences of worship and gathering people into community. So I find it fascinating that this is not going on in Sunday churches where many people are perhaps crying out, oh, I wish we could have more word of knowledge. I wish we could have more worship. I wish we could have more worship that was relevant. I wish we could have more, you know, more connection with the everyday. And I guess for me, the observation has been, and the wake-up call, and I guess the passion that you're hearing in my voice right now, is that I saw that week by week by week in community choirs more than I saw it in Sunday churches. So I'm still mulling over the implications of this radical openness, of this intentionally cultivated ambiguity of purpose for Christian worship. I'm wondering if we might extend the concept of conviviality, generally used for living together across racial, ethnic, or cultural barriers, to describe a particular type of spiritual gathering that both encompasses and goes beyond worship. Here, religious, spiritual, non-religious understandings are allowed to commingle, with none necessarily being privileged over the other. Spiritual conviviality in this sense would be a mode of social interaction that doesn't insist on a shared interpretation, but invites open consideration of many different viewpoints. In promoting this spiritual conviviality, musical organizations like gospel choirs are providing a unique space where the shifting relationships among individuals, communities, and traditional religious institutions within the contemporary United Kingdom, and perhaps elsewhere, are perceived as an opportunity for dialogue rather than a threat to Christian belief and practice. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We still have some minutes. We are trying to finish on times because we have the closing worship at 12:15, and you have already the link for the closing worship. So I asked the three panelists to choose one question. I know all questions are wonderful and valuable, but in matters of time sake, we will choose one question and they will give a brief answer, starting with Lee, following AnneMarie, and then Monique, and then we will close.
You should unmute, Lee.
Am I good now, I bet? You can hear me? Okay. Question from anonymous attendee about gentrification. That's a very controversial subject. I do have material on that on the website. My view is that gentrification is a mixed bag. It can contain both good and bad elements. I think that reinvestment in neighborhoods that have empty houses and empty lots and empty retail bays is generally a good thing. That kind of investment will bring about a rise in property values. That's also a good thing for present homeowners. The people who feel the pinch are renters, especially low-income renters. And so I think the key question here is how to have development without displacement, equitable development. And that's a hard thing to achieve, but I think that in cases of gentrifying neighborhoods, that's the primary challenge. Equitable development or development without involuntary displacement can be done, but it's very difficult.
Okay, so I will also answer a question that was posed by an anonymous attendee asking what happens when courage leads you to speak courageously to a Christian community who are not ready to hear and who then become angry or hostile to you and the very idea that you are trying to get across. Do you keep speaking or do you back off? I responded in part already to the question in the Q&A area, but the answer is it varies. Right? There are some steps that I didn't really have time to go through that I've been identifying and I'm still working through. But the first step is to know the context and the conditions of the soil that you're attempting to plant within, right? So you need to understand what's already going on there and understand your context and conditions and recognizing that you aren't going, I just started gardening, y'all. I used to garden as a child, but I've just started gardening again. And you realize that there are some seeds that don't work in certain soil and don't work in certain climates. right? And so there may be some aspects of a form of courageous resistance that you would desire, but it doesn't really work for that context. It doesn't really work for the conditions until you're able to do more of the tilling work, until you're able to do more of the weeding work, until you're able to really understand the history of the place and the people and what roots might already be there, so that you can prepare for planting the seeds, which becomes really knowing and understanding the systems and the structures that prevent human flourishing, et cetera. So the easy answer is it varies. And you have to begin to take your time in the same way that you just don't throw a seed into any random soil, you prepare it so that it can actually grow up well. And that's what you have to do with these courageous conversations. That's what you have to do with these concepts of resistance. Prepare the soil. Don't try to take them to 100. Start them at 1. Start with the 1 pound and build your way to the 100.
Yeah, and I think I can get Anonymous and Nicole's question kind of wrapped up into one here. An anonymous attendee asks about, yes, that question of cultural appropriation, which came up in every one of my interviews, whether or not I asked it or not. And I think that is one of the ways in which the British gospel choir dynamic is different from the American ones. Because gospel is still, for the most, well, I'll say it's complicated, but many are still thinking of gospel as coming from and ultimately being grounded elsewhere. The fact that it is from the United States and that it is emerging out of the experience of a very particular group of African diasporic individuals, that creates a distance, again, even in the case of some from West Africa or the Caribbean, where there is not as, from what I gathered, there is the sense of ownership is perceived differently. And so there are a lot of, there are white choirs, and there are some ones that have been founded in problematic ways. Unforgettable, kind of horrific story about a university gospel choir that was in which no one of African descent could make it through the admissions process, because it was run by basically a lot of music majors who demanded, crazy, knowledge of notation and other things. And so the Black group of students had to form their own gospel choir. So there was this British university with the white choir and the Black choir. However, there are a lot of other choirs in which there's one at a small Christian university, and there are a lot of choirs with this story that generally a person of Afro-Caribbean or West African descent has started, a choir, has raised up individuals within that choir who have then taken the mantle of leadership. And generally, in talking to those individuals, kind of the founders of these choirs, they interpret what they're doing kind of through the lenses of of Christian community, the fact that this is I'm sharing from, my own tradition, this tradition of worship music that granted I'm closer to than this other group of people is, but I think that they can be taught to perform in a way that is not appropriative. But I will say that, the current world situation and Black Lives Matter and everything that has gone on in the US has made this conversation a very different one. So I don't actually know, if my kind of 4-part what gospel, gospel's meaning to people in the UK isn't going to shift as the result of that, and the cultural appropriation conversation may become somewhat different. But thank you, those are good questions.
Thank you very much. This panel has been so inspiring. May the Lord continue working in each one of us for God's kingdom and righteousness. And please join us in the closing service. Blessings to everyone.
Thank you.